Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Kuhl for the opportunity to present here in this beautiful place with this great atmosphere and not somewhere on Zoom. But in general, it's really great to be here in Tartu, where biosemiotics is more present than anywhere else in the world. So I'm very happy to be here. And Mr. Taylor and all of our speakers being present here today, and to Herman for his help with the organization. So the topic of my talk is Flaw of Nature, Phaneron, and Relational Logic. Form and substance in Peirce, or Peirce as the first semiologist. It's actually a bit provocative title, but as I understood, not everyone here is familiar with Peirce. So I apologize for my topic, but you can understand it as a very, not very common introduction to Peirce, just in case you are not familiar. I will try to also resume some of the very elementary characteristics of his semiotics. Well, it is very common to understand Peirce somehow in contradiction to the structuralist movement or semiology. And in my opinion, this kind of contradiction is just arbitrary or artificially imposed by some scholars, and it happened some decades ago. I can mention the French linguist Émile Benveniste as one of the promoters of this idea of understanding Peirce in contradiction to structural movement in linguistics or in semiology. And, well, there are many arguments for supporting this understanding, this contradictory understanding of the two movements. One of the arguments is that the supposed closed dyadic approach in structuralism is not commensurable with triadic Peircean semiotics, which allows for the unlimited semiosis. But as you probably know, structural semiology has different strategies allowing for unlimited interpretive chains, such as is the case of connotative chains in Louis Onslaught or others. Another argument, and it is this one that actually Benveniste bases his essay upon, and this argument is the so-called logocentric argument, or the statement that for semiology, language was considered the primary semiotic modeling system, while in Peirce, language doesn't have this central role. Taylor will tell you many brilliant arguments to actually contradict this understanding of logocentrism, and his dissertation here was also based on the idea that logocentrism for structuralism means something a little different. So in Benveniste, you can read that Saussure as representative of structural semiology and Peirce as the representative of the so-called interpretive semiotics are considered as like two antithetic geniuses, or even he presents Saussure as the exact opposite of Peirce. Today I would like to talk about Peirce as actually one of the structuralist thinkers. Maybe you know that Umberto Eco focused on in his work on reconciling Peirce with structural semiology. It was his overall aim. But I would like to go even further and to say that Peirce was even more structuralist than semiologists themselves. And support my idea, I will show you some arguments from the formal approach of Peirce manuscripts, which I found mostly in his manuscripts on biology, form and matter in biological forms, his essays on evolution, or other aspects of organic development. And finally, I will argue that there is a way to have structuralism in biology without some kind of Platonic idealism. And I will try to convince you that there are ways to have this kind of structuralist thinking in biology, even today. To start, I will quote this famous paper, Logic of Relatives. It is one of the series because Peirce published many papers on the so-called Logic of Relatives, which is the first work in his, let's say, visual diagrammatical logic, also known as existential graphs. And these papers were published in between 1870 and 1897. So this one is the last one from the series, and is also the most referred to. This paper was entitled accordingly Logic of Relatives. So, to explain you what it actually is, Logic of Relatives in Peirce was initially a propositional logic. But in Peirce, as he has his triadic approach, also a proposition is to be understood triadically. And the best example of triad in a propositional logic is a verb. So I quote, a verb by itself signifies a mere dream, an imagination unattached to any particular occasion. It calls up in the mind an icon. A relative is just that, an icon or image, without a local habitation and a name, but indications of the need of such attachments. And to explain better what Peirce meant by this, we have, of course, the visual diagrams. So this one is from Peirce. So he's the most typical example of a verb, of a triadic approach to propositional logic is a verb to give, because this verb is tribal. So if you are familiar with the term verbal valency, maybe you've heard about it. Verbal valency is property of a verb explaining what was mentioned in the quote, that there are arguments, plural arguments, completing the very pragmatic meaning of the verb. Because the verb itself, to give, doesn't really express any meaning if we don't know who gives whom, what to whom. So, for this, Peirce is also understood somehow as a precursor of Augustin Tignac. Tignac proposed many decades after Peirce his very famous structural syntax, where he introduced the verbal valency. Probably it was totally dissociated from Peirce, but this is a very weird coincidence because these pictures are from Tignac's book, and you can see that also visually they are really quite alike. But for Peirce, in contradiction to Tignac, there is something more to be understood about the very valency, the verbal valency. It is not a pure syntax, but for him, it goes further in his philosophy, in his semiotics, and the overall understanding of the very structure of the nature and culture or any kind of semiotic phenomenon. So this is also why he chooses the verb to give, because it illustrates the best the very idea of triad. Triad is the very elementary structure for Peirce, the so-called relates. In this structure are the four arguments, the verb to give, and three named arguments John, John, John. So he chooses the sentence John gives John to John, which is a little bit confusing, but then his examples are maybe better or more realistic. But still, this example is to show you the very notion of their identity. Their identity is the basic principle of the so-called non-reduction theorem in Peirce. Non-reduction theorem means, as you can suppose, that we cannot reduce the triad. These are like triads. This is a triad. This is a triad. This would be the dyad. So the non-reduction theorem says that we cannot reduce a triad into some concatenation of pairs of dyadic relations. This is why a word such as to give cannot be decomposed into dyadic relations between the gift and the giver, the gift and the receiver and the giver. Because it all happens in one moment, it is one unique act of giving. And we can only understand it as such, not as decomposed, because the idea of giving consists in the very unique act of giving and receiving at the same time. So what is even more interesting that both Peirce and after him took inspiration from chemistry. Peirce actually was a real chemist because he started his studies in chemistry as a young student, only after he switched to mathematics and philosophy and so on and so on. But his very first contact with the academic milieu was through chemistry. So he first studied the chemical radicals, and he also was at the beginning of the term the chemical valency appeared actually. So then he only took the very chemical valency, applied it to propositional logic, and he proposed a verbal valency. So when we talk about structures or forms, it is necessary to mention also substance or matter, because form or structure is usually explained through contradiction with substance or matter. At least this is what happens in semiology. You probably know about Louis Janslav, who introduced the terminology form, substance, etc., etc. But it has roots in the Saussure already, and it has a long tradition, of course. This topic of the contradiction between substance and form is absent in Peirce studies. I think that it is absent because of what I told at the beginning, because of the fact that there is this supposed boundary line separating structuralism from Peirce, and such as form substance is so essential for semiology, it is somehow unimportant for Peirce. But what is interesting is that when you go and study Peirce papers or even unpublished manuscripts, you will discover that he talks a lot about form and substance, and it seems that this distinction was really important for him, especially in his manuscripts on biology, is where we can find many mentions of form, substance, dichotomy, or binarism, whatever you want. So this is of course going towards the structural understanding of biological structures, which is very often associated with Platonic idealism, with the understanding of life forms as some substantiations of Platonic ideal forms. And this goes back to Aristotle, of course. Maybe the most recent instance of the Platonic approaches in biology was in the 19th century in the form of biological structuralism. Some scholars argue that Platonic understanding of forms in biology never disappeared, that it is recurrently re-emerging under different forms. And the most recently, we can find it in proteomics studies on proteins. There is a paper from 2002 by Denton, where he very openly argued that proteins are actually only substantiations of Platonic protein forms. Now, this paper is very radical. I won't argue to support this argument, but I only wanted to demonstrate that this kind of understanding is still present even today in biology. And the most recent is proteomics, DNA studies, etc. Well, even if we probably won't agree on that, there are Platonic forms in biology, we hopefully will agree on that there are forms. Forms in nature do exist. It is undeniable, and all the present studies in the field of proteomics are based upon this presupposition that there are forms, even though, of course, we don't understand them as Platonic forms. Some do, as Denton, but this is rather a marginal case. So now we can go back to Peirce and his notion of Phaneron. In this following slides, I would like to show you the possible connection between proteins, Phaneron, and Peirce's relational logic, or his, well, let's say, diagrammatic understanding of life forms. So Phaneron in Peirce is everything which is present to mind. It is our cognition, it is our, let's say, also brain activity, it is our perception of the world. And for Peirce, the definition of Phaneron is structural. He applies his relational logic, the logic of relatives, to describe what is Phaneron. And the elementary structure of Phaneron is the triad, because it is the elementary structure of every kind of phenomena in nature and in culture. But we can ask a question: where does the forms of the Phaneron come from? So, if we apply some kind of recursive optic, we can say that it is traced all the way down, and that the Phaneron is that extension of elementary biomolecular structures, which are that extension of the elementary chemistry of matter, which is also structural, as we see with the example of chemical radicals. So here, I go back to the ammonia molecule, the favorite example of Peirce, which is in itself only a proposition John gives John to John. They share the very same structure. So when you observe the molecule of ammonia, it is difficult to say actually whether this is a question of form or substance at the very basic elementary chemical level. And I would argue that for Peirce, it is more about the structure, of course, because what can be found in Peirce's writings is that he described matter or substance as dyadic. It acts by brute force, it is a pure index, while form is triadic. Therefore, it has primacy over matter. Peirce goes even further, and he really did connect proteins with Phaneron. Even though proteins were not quite studied in his lifetime, he was very interested in the chemical structure of the organic matter, so he was aware of proteins so far as he could. And this is a quote from manuscript 134, where he talks about proteins as those super molecules. And so at the end of the quote, he says, it is certainly too early to take those into account in holding the exposition of the constitution of the Phaneron. So why he really puts into one sentence proteins and Phaneron, well, I can tell you this manuscript is actually a manuscript on the very valence theory. So this is all connected in this manuscript before. When Peirce tries to explain the valency, the verbal valency, logical relatives, and to help his arguments, he goes to proteins and he goes to Phaneron, and he concludes that Phaneron and proteins shares the very structure. This is where he sees the analogy between organic matter and human cognition in some kind of structural analogy. So, this is clearly a very formal approach, very structural approach, and Peirce not very known, but it is there. And now I would like to address the question what we can do with that, how is it compatible with the current studies in biology or in biosemiotics even. So to really use forms in biology and not to go towards the Platonic idealism and search of the Platonic forms in nature, we should, and I think this is the only possibility, take into account the reverse order between form and substance. Because, and this is where the Peircean paradox lies in. Peirce was really more structuralist than semiologists themselves, in that he clearly stated the primacy of the form over the substance, while some of the structuralist thinkers allowed for a reverse order. That means that there is no supremacy of form over substance, but it can be vice versa. So we can find something in this direction in the work by Remas and Cortez. They used the notion of reciprocal presupposition, and this topic was very recently elaborated by Taylor, again in his dissertation. And Taylor uses the term retroactivity to talk about this reverse order between form and substance. So to conclude, what is Peirce's approach towards form? Of course, his approach is very formalistic, but at the same time, I wouldn't say it is a Platonic approach. He doesn't really attribute Platonic idealism to forms in nature, to forms in biology, or in the organic development. And here I quote another manuscript. This one is entitled Flaw of Nature. So in this manuscript, he resumes all the history of the natural philosophy, starting like Aristotle and going towards his times. So he defines here biological growth as becoming a given structure. But this structure is not predetermined, it's not Platonic ideas. Yet the structure is embodied in matter. And this is very different from the Aristotelian or Platonic organic forms. One more quote from the Baer's manuscript. You can see here in this red area that Peirce really he writes about organic forms, and he says that they are different from the Platonic idea, and he bases his arguments on the scholastic philosophy. Because the Platonic idea was supposed to be all the more perfect for being free from matter, while the scholastic nature had no being at all except in the sense that it was going to be embodied. So there is the idea of embodiment in the substance, in the very matter. And in short, a mere being in futuro, a being about to be. So to really understand what forms mean for Peirce, we have to revise his account on potentialities or real possibilities in nature. Peirce was very interested in this kind of topics, mostly in his papers on pragmatism or his realism. As some of you might know, Peirce was famous for his realistic tendency, and very famous is his anecdote about the diamond. So we can find this in several papers, the same story, based upon the question, what does it mean if I say that a diamond is hard? And whether it still would be hard even if no one ever touched it, and it was situated for hundreds of years somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. So Peirce's account on this changed through his philosophy, but at the end, like in his later philosophy, he would answer this question through the scholastic realistic thinking, which is very different from Aristotle. As was already clear from the previous quote. So the Aristotelian understanding of potentialities of nature is that one, the Platonic idealism, forms are understood as to be Platonic forms existing in some ideal world. Eventually, this is what Aristotle calls nature of an animal. Nature of a plant is its ideal form. But contrary to this, in the scholastic realistic thinking, potential being is related to the present, to the undecided present, which eventually is related to the future as well. But what is important is that it has to be embodied in the matter sooner or later. We do not know at the present time, but we will know in the future. And these possibilities are real in Peirce. They are called real possibilities, contrary to ideal forms. And so through this we go to the various semiotics of Peirce, because the real possibilities are also signs, because signs are relations, and relations are perfect examples of real possibilities in nature. Relation is something which does exist, but in the possibility. It is not embodied, but it eventually can be embodied in matter. And to conclude, the very definition of sign in Peirce is structural. Well, of course, there you will find no mention of form, substance distinction in the basic introductions to Peirce, nor in his papers on sign doctrine, but you will find many mentions of form, substance, Binarism in his biological writings. And I would like to argue that there is actually very formalistic approach also in Peirce science doctrine. It is not mentioned somehow explicitly, but you can see that it is implicit when you observe the very diagram of Peirce sign. Sign is defined structurally as the mutual relations between object, interpretant, and representative. There is no other definition of sign than this one, and it is like a structural definition. Thus, a sign is but the mutual relations between the relates of this triad. The relates are object, interpreter, and representative. And all we need to define the sign is how these relates interact with each other. What are the structures between them? And to conclude my presentation, I would like to mention the aesthetic function of the form matter, Binarism. In Friedrich Schiller, the form matter is transformed into sensuous impulsion and formal impulsion in man, like two contradictory tendencies. He would say that sensuous impulsion controls us physically, and the formal impulsion controls us morally. So these two tendencies in man are contradictory, but they are complementary at the same time. And this complementarity constitutes very, very aesthetic function. And on the background of my slide, you can see the picture. It is a drawing by Karl, and you of course know it's very famous. It was entitled posthumously A Labyrinth of Signs. So according to some scholars, this drawing represents better than anything else the real Peirce understanding of what sign is or semiosis. So this was only to illustrate that also in Peirce we can find aesthetic inclination. And